Yeah, good evening. My name is Ed Friedman. I'm the chairman of Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, and I'm proud to introduce this evening's speaker, Kerry Hardy. You'll note behind me, beautiful Merrymeeting Bay, kind of at sunset, and the reason for that is that we forgot to tape this intro when we recorded Kerry, who spoke at our annual meeting on January 11th, 2012. So for those of you that don't know, Friends of Merrymeeting Bay is a very interesting environmental organization in that we look at the environment in an ecosystem fashion. So that's reflected in our work in that we do research. We have an active education program in the school systems around the Bay, Merrymeeting Bay. We are an active land trust, and we do a lot of advocacy work as well. So like beads in a wampum belt, writers carefully stitch together words to create images. But what is conveyed by a solitary word? To Kerry Hardy, a single word can reveal important connections between people and the landscape in which they live. More specifically, between the Wabanaki and their ancestral home in Maine. Those words are from a book review of Kerry's book, Notes on a Lost Flute, and they come from a review from the Orion magazine. As a naturalist, artist, eco-historian, linguist, author, Kerry studies the human ecology of pre-contact Native Americans, primarily by analyzing the words in which they use to describe the world around them. As Kerry says, the oldest words in any language are like little time capsules packed full of ancient thoughts. If you can crack an old word open and let those thoughts out, you start to see what the land and its people were like long ago, and history starts to really come alive for you. Kerry has a master's degree in landscape architecture from SUNY, State University of New York, College of Environmental Science and Forestry. For many years, he was director of the Merry Spring Nature Center in the Camden-Rockport area. Kerry wrote Notes in 2009, which led to becoming a keynote speaker at the 2010 Common Ground Fair. He's currently working on a new book. Most recently, Kerry spoke at the 2011 Algonquian Conference in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and helped plan and serve a native foods banquet at that event. He lives in Rockland, rides his bicycle almost anywhere else in the state in the name of research, recreation, or advocacy. I met Kerry years ago while testifying at the legislature on fish passage issues, and he's since become a good friend and has supported our work in wonderful ways. What's particularly unique is that when the Natural Resources or Marine Resources Committees in Augusta are tired of hearing us suggest very strongly that they should, as Thoreau said, hear the fishes when they cry, and they attempt to halt our testimony, Kerry will rise, excusing himself, and mention he has bicycled all the way from Camden to testify and would like the chance. Legislators gulp, look shamed, shut up, and give Kerry the floor, as I now do. Thank you.
Hi, it's nice so many people thought this was worth coming out for tonight. 5 years ago I had no idea that I would be writing a book, but I have since a fairly early age in life had a lot of faith in following one's bliss, and that's what led to it all. There's one funny connection I'll tell you quickly about that was also part of it. And that is, in a way, it kind of goes back to a guy teaching ecology at the University of Maine at Orono, who, of course, now I'll forget his name. It wasn't Buck Yellin, but the guy who taught before him was Coulter. Mal Coulter was his name. And back in the 60s, it would have been a skinny undergraduate kid who was taking one of Mal Coulter's forestry classes, was also running a trap line. And doing some sketches of the things he caught on his trap line, the tracks he was seeing, or jotting down some of the things he saw while he was out checking his trap line. And Mal Coulter encouraged this kid, whose name was Bernd Heinrich, to send his little stories in for publication somewhere. And without that encouragement, Bernd has told me that he probably wouldn't be a writer today. It was just one of those seminal things. The reason that matters to me is that about 10 or more years ago, 12 years maybe, my wife and I found ourselves alone on Thanksgiving, and having just read Ravens in Winter, that Bernd is in that book. He's kind of teasing about you might stumble across this camp where I wrote this if you roam around western Maine long enough. So we took that as a challenge and went to the middle of nowhere. There's no driveway really especially to the camp that it was a hovel, Camp Kaflunk, where he spent the winter watching ravens and deciphering their language. But we parked on the side of the Route 156, walked up a mountainside where we thought we were in the vicinity, stepped over a stone wall, found a tote road, and walked about 50 feet and came to a clearing that Camp Kaflunk was sitting in. And there were also a set of footprints there, which we followed, that led to a cabin that looks like the cover of a year in the Maine woods. And there was a deer hanging in the tree. And I'm a deer hunter. And it just so happened it was Thanksgiving. Bernd's wife and his nephew's wife were scheduled to bring them Thanksgiving dinner from Burlington. There was a blizzard there. So Bernd and Charlie were down to a can of beans and a can of beer to their name. Christina and I had a picnic dinner that we had brought with us. So Bernd and I have gotten along wonderfully ever since. And without the encouragement of hearing what his life had been like and how he came to writing, I probably never would have written a book too. So that's kind of a shaggy dog story, but I never get tired of telling it to people because it has been inspiring to me, and that's one thing I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight is some of the inspiring people you meet as a result of doing something like this. But I'm going to start talking about my book, Notes on a Lost Flute. Going to end talking about what I hope will be the next thing I'm writing, and you'll meet a few people and see a few things that happened along the way. This little background slide, that's actually McGonagall Lake where I grew up in Lincolnville and Camden. But this is kind of a guiding thing to me because Native American studies didn't really grab me until I forced myself to grapple with coming to grips with the language. And once I did, especially because their language is nature-based, and as a kid I was very nature-based, and then these words started making sense to me. So as I tell people, after about 23 months of spinning my wheels with the language, all of a sudden I started getting some traction. And the other thing that really made the language come alive was realizing that the Algonquian peoples extend from northwest beyond Lake Superior all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, all the way down to the Carolinas. But the language is virtually the same with different dialects throughout that region. So a lot of the missing bits of information, when I had gone through the whole historic record that I could find for Native American groups in this part of the Northeast, when I broadened my dragnet and started processing word lists from Michigan and from Illinois and from the Cree in northern Canada, suddenly I started finding the missing pieces of the puzzle. So I remain immersed in language studies. One of the great Algonquian linguists to ever practice, spent a lot of his time in Maine, Frank Siebert, who for basically 30 years, I think, and my friend Nick can correct me if I make any egregious blunders, but Siebert worked with the Penobscot at least that long, didn't he, Nick?
I think longer.
Yeah, maybe 40. Long time. His life's work, basically. as an amateur, he was a dental pathologist, I think, by training, but this is what grabbed him. He had so much of a flair for it that when Frank Speck was Siebert's instructor, I believe it was Speck, who was instructing him at Penn as a student, realized that this guy was better, and he had this student teach the linguistics portion of the class. So he just had a lot of aptitude, and because of his efforts, we've retained what we have about the Penobscot language. A friend who didn't make it here tonight, I guess, but was very critical in following through after Siebert died, is a young, incredibly gifted linguist from Portland named Connor Quinn, who, as a 16-year-old, was sent to spend the summer with Siebert, and in very short order was able to download much of what Siebert had recorded over 40 years' time, basically into his own brain and computer, but mostly into his brain. So the connection was kept unbroken, and Siebert died shortly thereafter. But I'm kind of the reverse of this this quote from Siebert. I was not a linguist or a lexicographer at all, but I was a bit of an amateur naturalist, so I thought, well, maybe it'll work in the reverse direction, and I applied myself and have had some luck. This is an example of the kind of things you do, and this is one that Siebert tumbled to. The Penobscot word for widow and pair is the same, sigusque. And it literally breaks down, I believe, to abandoned woman or empty, discarded surplus woman. But the reason the Penobscots would call a pair the same name as a widow, when a Penobscot brave died, his widow would blacken her cheeks for a period of up to a year, and then when the mourning period was over, she would indicate it by painting her cheeks red. So the red cheeks are what widows and pairs have in common, and that's the kind of puzzle you run into when you're dealing with people who are very, very inclined to metaphor, which all the Algonquians are. A few of the things, most of what Siebert did is impeccable, and I'm certainly no one to even offer criticism on him, but I will say that I noticed a few cases where Siebert was only as good as what his informants were telling him on a few words. So over time, as with any language, the meaning of words changes, and in this case, the word that once meant alewives, and Father Rall actually recorded the word for it in his 1723 dictionary. By the time Siebert was with the Penobscots, that name had been reassigned to saltwater smelts. So if some of you may recognize the name Amezaconte, which we now call Farmington Falls. In Father Rall's day, it meant place of alewives. Siebert's Penobscot informants translated it for him as the place of smelts. That actual place, Farmington Falls, as we call it, is above the range of saltwater smelts. There are waterfalls they can't get to, and there are no lakes nearby deep enough, clean enough for there to be freshwater smelts that would ever make it there. So that's how we know it had to be a place of alewives when the Indian name first came. But that's the only kind of quibble I ever have with anything of Siebert's. Here's another one. The snowberry, which is a plant you see a lot in northern Maine, the Indian name for it, gawasamine, and it means fallen log berry. And it's very descriptive because the snowberry plant does feed on rotting logs in the North Maine woods. It has a white berry. I guess there aren't any in this. It's a cousin to the wintergreen berry, which you see here. So Siebert said, well, this breaks down into gawas, which is pine, and berry. And the reason the Indians call fallen logs pines is because once the Europeans came here, that was what they cut. They wanted those big white pines. I actually believe he was wrong, and I think Gawas means laying down or sleeping, which is an accurate way to describe a dead tree. When you look at all of the Algonquian languages, you see that gawas or kawas in anything to do with sleeping. So there's just little things like that that sometimes I find, and I think he might have been off a little. To the Penobscots, this plant is, I forget the Penobscot word for it, but anyway, all of the other Algonquian groups around the Penobscots have a name something like pakalus, for cow parsnip, a big medicinal plant, and it's also a food plant. The Penobscots have flip-flopped the name for this plant with one of the Aralias, which is also a medicinal plant. So Siebert went with the Penobscot word, and I think they're the only Algonquian group that has made that name switch. But words in any language and names in any language do change over time. But this was the kind of stuff that I found fun. Here's a Lenape, or Delaware as we call them, their word for the butternut, and this is the nut itself, quinoquimine. It means long nut. Anytime you see mean on the end of a noun in any Algonquian language, it's talking about a seed, a nut, a fruit, a berry. And the quinoc, if you think about it, you know a state that has that in its name. Quinocticut, long river. That's what Connecticut means. And that's where that silent C in Connecticut, the second one, that nobody ever knows why it's there, it's a placeholder. It's retaining way back when the root that means long, quinoc, was sounded. So the first white people to the Connecticut River would have heard it called Quinoctigook, if it was an Abenaki saying it, or Quinoctigut if it was like a Massachusetts saying it. But anyways, so stuff like that makes sense. Once I learned what a berry was, and then I know why it's a long nut, because here's its counterpart. Here's a cousin of it. You know, the black walnut, the very close relative of butternut. That's potok we mean, and potok means round. So, you know, the leaves look identical. Naturally, you would describe one as being the long nut and the other as being the round nut. So there were enough small successes along the way that made sense to me that I would keep going with it. Different Algonquian dialects now, the first word for turkey, Misabine, would be something in the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, or Ottawa language bunch. And the second word, chickanem, would be from the Delaware, or Lenape. What's fun about them, the first one just translates to big bird, which is a very logical name for turkey. The fun one is the second one, because the Delaware word for broom is shikahigan. Higan means useful object. And so the shika is about sweeping, and it's onomatopoeic. You know, it's about that sound that you get when you use a broom. And the reason you call a turkey the sweeper, if you've ever watched them go through the woods, pawing through the leaf litter, looking for insects or nuts, it's a very good description. And as my wife pointed out to me after I was patting myself on the back for that, she said, they also use turkey wings as brooms. Oh, yeah! She was right. And the really fun part of that is the last three letters, because that ending very often indicates a domesticated animal in Algonquian languages. Now, the Hopi, when the Spaniards first came there, long before the Mayflower ever landed, I must admit, to the New Mexico and Arizona area, turkeys were kept as domestic animals. So it's just interesting to me seeing that suffix that hints at it being a domesticated animal, though I've never seen any evidence of that in the Northeast. This was one of my epiphanies, and I never do a talk without mentioning it. Many of you probably know the bittern. It has a lot of colorful names here in New England, like Medahan. But the Indian name I had trouble with, and it bugged me for about a year, why they called it the meal bird or the flour bird. And I finally, after about a year, I had one of those hair standing up on the neck moments where it was suddenly perfectly clear to me. If you look at all of the English nicknames for the bittern, they're all about repetitive loud noises, thumping sort of noises, which is the bittern's mating call. Yeah. And I will do my, you didn't think you'd see bird impressions tonight, but I will do one for you. When the bitterns are mating, you'll hear a noise that's like, and it will carry for miles across a swamp. And so finally I realized it's about the sound of crushing nuts or corn in a wooden mortar, that resonant pounding sound, which is why they called the bittern the cornmeal or the nut meal bird, because it sounded like it was out there using a mortar. And this was an epiphany for me, because I'd never read this, despite collecting everything I could get my hands on trying to understand it. Nobody had ever written down and said, this is what this name's about. And then I thought, maybe it's because linguists don't know what a bittern sounds like. And sure enough, the more I kept going with this stuff, I realized there was really a place for a naturalist who could grapple with these words and maybe supply some missing details. Here's another word that intrigued me. I always was struck by how close the word for fishhook was to the word for our, the bones that make up the front of us. And then in reading a Penobscot book written in the 1890s by a guy named Joseph Nicolar, he goes into the instructions that the Penobscots received from their culture hero Gluskap, saying, take a bone out of the breast of a bird and grind it against a rock, and then tie the other, and put bait on it and tie the other end to a string, and this is how you'll catch fish. And suddenly the connection between fish hook and breastbone was crystal clear to me. And again, it's nothing I've ever seen written up, but just from a common sense point of view, I will stand against any linguist and ask them to come up with a better reason. And just as a side note, we talk about angling in English. If you go back to the days of Isaac Walton, the granddaddy of all anglers, the phrase was actually fishing with an angle. And that's why we call fishing angling, and there's the angle. But that's what it's all about. It's following these words back to what was the crystallized idea behind the word. And then when that happens, you suddenly feel very close to these people from long ago. So this is just a glimpse in my tortured life. I have many notebooks filled with stuff like this. This particular list is from the Menominee in Wisconsin. And what I do is get my hands on a word list, and this one was recorded in the late 1800s. The older the better, as far as I'm concerned. I write the words down, and I find that transcribing helps me remember them. And when I see something that doesn't make sense to me, it gets a question mark. When I see something that is perfectly sensible and a neat story, it gets one of these. And I highlighted my translation of it. But it's kind of interesting. So, they're making their own thread and twine out of things like nettles, milkweed stalks, whatever. But they use this bone with a hole drilled through it to pull the fibers through to make them smooth and uniform and flexible. And so the word etymologizes. Api or abi is always something about a string or a thread. And the wikan, there again, is that useful object. So it's the thread or the fiber tool. And you'll see a lot of different things going on here. Some are linguistic, Some are about the social divisions, the Big Thunder fratry. That's kind of weird stuff. But basically, this is about clans that took their inspiration from different animals. So you might be bear clan, you might be eagle clan. If you were osprey, if that was your totem animal, you were in this Big Thunder fratry, which included a lot of flying, a lot of birds of prey were the members of the Big Thunder clan. So sometimes I'll put ethnographic stuff. This one interested me. We talk about the, yachters on the Maine coast talk about seeing the green flash, and lo and behold, here in Wisconsin is the word for the greenish tint seen at early daybreak, which they ascribe to a mythical woman. So I'll go through a word list and solve what I can and puzzle about the ones I can't. You can see here's just another page. And it's mostly natural world words I'm collecting. This is fun. Shakeen is urine. From that they got shigak, skunk. The pisser was basically what they were calling him. And then Chicago, which we now know as Chicago, was the place. And that is the name that is the Native American name behind Chicago. And what was unique about this, I've written, this could be true, because he actually tells that there's a Menominee legend or a handed down story that while their people were at the Illinois River there, or the Chicago River, a skunk started swimming across the river and drowned halfway across. And that's just goofy enough that that might be why Chicago is Chicago. And you can see, in my own notebook, I'm not at all modest. I've patted myself on the back under that. That one I resolved. But this was the first time I've ever found a name for silver maple. And the guy who recorded this got it kind of wrong. He calls it soft maple. And I don't know, maybe it wasn't called silver maple then. But when you break it down into shipi, which is river, Ashpoma is sugar, and Atik is tree. So it's the sugar tree that grows along rivers. And if you've ever been along the Androscoggin up by Rumford, where it's just nothing but an alley of silver maples, the light bulb comes on. And I was just, this is what keeps me going when I find something like that. And it's just unquestionable in my mind that I actually have a real name. Granted, it's from Wisconsin, but it's something that I feel is solid and that I can build on. So that's kind of what I have 8 or 10 of these notebooks, blank pages just filled with stuff like this. And when I had 4 or 5 of them filled, I decided I had to write that first book, and I have more than that now. So there's a second one on the way. Now I'm going to talk about some people, and one of them is here with me tonight. Nick Smith is in the audience, and when I got going on this stuff, not being the bashful type, I went to a conference and Bruce Bork was speaking there, and I actually printed out a list of about a half dozen questions and gave them to anybody who was speaking, figuring they knew more than me. And one of the questions was, when the Europeans first came here, was it L dialect, R dialect, or N dialect that was being spoken? All of these are possible. And Bruce Bork looked at it and he said, this isn't my stuff. The only guy who would even have a clue about that, I don't even know if he's still alive. He was down in Brunswick. But he said, the guy named Nick Smith might know. And again, not being shy, I just dug around phone books until I found Nick Smith and called him cold and invited myself down to talk with him. And I still do that. I invite myself down and I come down and talk with him. But he has a great collection from about 65 years of working purely for the love of the subject matter with Maliseets, Penobscots, and Passamaquoddies. And these are some of the kind of things that Nick has done, working with a Maliseet man who was a folklorist named Peter Paul. One of the things they did was to find one of the Edward Tappan Adney canoe models, and these things are just incredibly rare and valuable. And this one, I don't know how they came across it, but one of you recognized it as probably being a Tappan Adney, didn't you? Yeah.
This work is no other work like it.
Yeah, and yeah. So as a result, this is pulled out of someone's attic and now in a museum somewhere.
Now in the National Museum of Canada.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Photographs of the last people who kind of remembered how to do this stuff. And I seem to remember the name Pulches goes with this guy. Is that right? Arthur Pulches? Well, anyways, is he Passamaquoddy or Maliseet?
He was Maliseet.
Maliseet. Okay, and reenacting one of the dances. And you can see the gourd rattle has been replaced with a cow horn rattle filled with shot, probably. But the headdress, I think, is the way I've always read that Maliseet and Passamaquoddy headdresses were done. Typically either turkey or partridge feathers, and standing up very vertically, not falling down like the Plains Indian ones. And he's got a buckskin outfit on, but I mean, this stuff is gone. And some of Nick's photographs, that was, I think he was told that was the last of the Indian dog, the dogs that had the real look of what the hunting dogs that the Indians had. The man on the far right is Sebastian Toma, who was a Passamaquoddy chief. And Nick told me that when he got to know Nick and trust him, he wanted Nick to take his picture, and he insisted on getting out his full regalia, the actual chief's outfit. So I quickly realized I'd stumbled into a gold mine by meeting Nick and have haunted his back door ever since. One of the other things Nick was an influence on was the starting of the Algonquian Conference, which is now up to its 43rd year, and Nick has been to about 40 of them. And this is where the best Algonquian linguists out there are. The guy at the head of the table is Ives Goddard Jr., who works for the Smithsonian and is kind of Algonquian linguist number 1. This guy might be Algonquian linguist number 2 or 3, but they're all just towers of intellect. And because of Nick telling me I should go to one of these conferences, I actually did this past fall. I met these people, and since Nick couldn't go, I made them pose for a picture that I could send back to him. Why I went was because I wanted to feed them some authentic Native American food. This is a hen clam that came from up around Duck Trap in Lincolnville, Maine. A lot of meat on that, and so I smoked some hen clams and took them out. This name was an easy one, I thought, to resolve. The Kachi means big. The Pequehawk, you might actually recognize in that its smaller cousin, the Pequehawk. It's what we call quahogs in Maine. In Rhode Island, they call them quahogs. But this is where the purple wampum beads came from, was the nose of that shell. And these are just some of the various Algonquian versions of the name that means clam or mussel, which I think is about slicing, and which Ives Goddard thinks is about something else. So we're still going back and forth about that. And there they are smoking in my backyard in Rockland. We got lucky because the restaurant that was doing the cooking is a place called Zingerman's Roadhouse in Ann Arbor, Michigan. A really famous restaurant that has won James Beard Awards, and the guy cooking has won them. And whatever I wanted to serve up, he was game to try, and that included going out. The green scum on this little pond near where I was camped out in Michigan, I recognized was duckweed, and I had seen an Indian word that made me think it was edible, so I collected 5 pounds of it, strained it, and parboiled it just long enough to kill the critters and served it to them, and I think everyone made it through okay. So That's what it looks like floating on a pond. And the word list that I'd seen it in talked about how fond the deer were of it. And I know that deer were a real food model for Indians. They knew that if a deer could eat something, they could. So I crossed my fingers, and it worked. It's in the, and plus it's in the crucifery. You know, you can see the 4 leaves. So that there's a lot of good food plants in that. It seemed like a safe bet. I threatened them. I didn't take this. I have been known to pick up roadkill raccoon, but I didn't see any good ones on the way out there. But that's what they would have looked like in October. The Indians loved them because they put on so much fat, and the fat was like bear fat. It renders very easily and stays sweet a long time. And getting fat in November was what it was all about in the old days. So this is the setup. The Androscoggin River. If you read the old histories, the ledges right here in Topsom were called Amir Kongan. It means where we dry fish. And so back in the day, they didn't have nice racks like this. We're doing planked walleye for the meal, and that's elk jerky drying beside it. But back in the old days, when shad were running the Kennebec and Androscoggin, planked fish would have been served right here in Topsom, and that's kind of how it would have been done. Okay, this is what I'm hoping is next in my life. Basically, the research I've done since that book came out has just been about broadening the scope of Algonquian people I'm looking at. And, it's just going to be another collection of short and, I hope, interesting stories. And I described my first book as bathroom reading to people, because you can, in 5 minutes, you can knock off one chapter and or at least one essay. And it's just the way I like approaching the material. So the challenge of this next book is writing about things that we've lost or are on the brink of losing, like anadromous fish or little things like that, and still making it be upbeat and interesting reading that doesn't make people just want to jump off a bridge or something. So the kind of stuff that anadromous fish are going to be a big part of it. And we have some great early stuff. This is from like 1584 down in Virginia. I think White was the artist who did this. And he's just showing every kind of Indian fishing he can think of. You can see, looks like a sturgeon maybe that's about to get the shaft there. And they're using a fire on a big piece of birch bark with gravel over it. That's how they would have a fire to attract fish in their canoe. Of course, they're in a dugout. There's a stick weir here, and what's interesting is the graduated ponds in that weir are exactly how they used to get Atlantic salmon on the Penobscot River, the white people. If you read about Atlantic salmon fishing in the 1800s, it was the same kind of nested ponds in a weir, and the fish would just keep going farther and farther in, trying to escape. But anyway, so there's stuff like that to process. One of the really cool things about knowing Ed Friedman is that he's got a great toy. And I had planted the seed, I'm sure, that someday I'd like to go up with him. And he probably was naive enough to think that it might be a paying gig. But anyway, he was kind enough to take me up one day, and we flew the Kennebec. And I'm going to just show you the kinds of stuff that is interesting to me now. These are some of the things you see from the air. Unusual stone features that are hard to explain by other than human intervention. There's a little stream, and interestingly, all the stones are about basketball sized, and they kind of form a straight line other than what freshets have knocked apart. And you just see these in a lot of different places. And another interesting guy that I've met does a lot of great work with FOMB, and that's Doug Watts up in Augusta. And when Doug read my book, and when I wrote some stuff about Native American use of fish for legislative testimony, Doug said, I think I've seen some stone weirs. And he started sending me pictures. And come to find out, he was indeed onto it. And these old stone weirs are probably the oldest extant man-made structures in New England. They are not protected. Some of them, archaeologists haven't even visited the shore alongside them.
I visited that one.
How's that?
I visited that one.
Have you? Yeah. Yeah. And so here's Doug. Doug and I went out on the Sebasticook one day, to just look at these. And this is just after the Fort Halifax Dam had been blown. And is that 7 Mile, the stream that comes in, the first tributary upstream, Nate?
China Lake.
That's China Lake Stream? Okay. So this is right where China Lake Stream comes down. And here again, at this choke point in the river, and I'll show it to you from above in a second, we found all these basketball-sized stones. Okay, so here's where we were in that first one. And what's interesting is the weirs were built as V's basically, and if it's a downstream pointing V, it means that they took eels there. Eels migrating down the streams in the fall, heading to the ocean. So, and reading about stone weirs farther down the seaboard, there's a lot of W-shaped ones. That makes perfect sense because the points of a W allow you to take upstream swimming alewives or shad or downstream swimming eels. So you can see all of these stones that are kind of the same size, and you kind of get some of that sawtoothing going on. Well, that's not conclusive proof in and of itself. It's just an interesting coincidence because, a stream comes in right here, and it's a choke point on the Sebasticook. Now that we can see what the historic level of the Sebasticook was because the dam's gone. Yay. Here's what it looks like from ground level, and you can see that biggest point. But it's not hard to imagine that it might have been a fishing station. Now, while we're standing on shore here, what should we pick up but a rock that has a curious dent? And Art Spiess, who I love dearly, and
Who sends his regards but couldn't make it tonight.
Couldn't make it tonight. I sent Art some photographs, and he said, well, I don't want to rain on your parade, but this was caused by a smaller stone rotating in the current and grinding its way down into the stone. So we'll see another one of those in a few minutes. I think we've got some other things that are going to be treated more in depth in the next book. The whole connection between wild rice and Merrymeeting Bay, though I touched on it in my first book, I really want to go a lot deeper, especially now that we have some pollen samples that indicate wild rice being present on the bay in pre-contact times. So material like that I want to get in it. One way that I can kind of keep the book upbeat is that we're making some progress on some of these lost things. Sorry about the garish color there, but we're one generation away from having American chestnuts that we can reintroduce to the forest. That's a great thing, and it'll be a boon to things like bears and turkey, deer, partridge. It'll be a wonderful thing, and that'll happen in our lifetimes. Some of these things are just too tough even for white American culture to kill, like Jerusalem artichoke. That's still with us, and it's a great food, and it'll make a comeback.
Is the artichoke on the left?
They're both. That's the root of the artichoke as it naturally grows. Of course, we have nice, fat, succulent cultivars. But yeah, that's what the blossom looks like. And you can see in Champlain's map from 1606 a plant that's easy to identify as Jerusalem artichoke. So you know it was part of the food regime back then. Those are two names. Bun means edible root. The bun is how they say it. It looks like pen. But that first word is banak, and it just means the plural of edible root. And Chickabee is what Champlain's traveling companion Marc Lescarbot recorded as the Indian name for this food. And I've got different ideas about what that might be, but I think the abee part is about string because those stalks have nice tough fibers in them, and I believe they were used for making string. Canada lily is one that's almost gone, and it was a hugely important food when you read the old historic material. But it is still at least here and can be brought back. Groundnut, another one that's too tough for us to kill. Plus it likes growing in swamps where you can't put condominiums, so it's still out there and will be a food again someday. In fact, a famous American botanist of the previous early part of the 20th century, Fernald at Cornell, said if the South American potato hadn't been available, we would have bred groundnut up into something very much like it by now. And so that may still be in the future. Mayapple. Some of you may have seen the plant or the flower, but to see the seed is even rarer because raccoons love them, a lot of things love them. But this is still growing at a place in Camden that I go to. What could be more New England than baked beans? And the bean of choice is Jacob's cattle, right? Usually at a bean supper. Well, that bean was a gift from the Passamaquoddy Indians to the first white settler in that part of the world. So that one's safe, but it's time to give credit and say, oh wait, this is Indian food. It's not white New England food. If you ever, some of you may have at Common Ground Fair this year gotten a chance to buy some of this Abenaki Flint cornmeal from the young couple right by the Rose Gate as you just come in from Songbird Farm. That was what they called it. It is the best tasting cornmeal my wife and I have ever had. It just makes heavenly pancakes, and everybody should be growing that. Okay, I said we'd see another rock. This came from right, if you remember the picture on the Kennebec with the helicopter and Ed in it, I picked this rock up just beside where the helicopter sat down, and I think it was Ed's idea to put the bird down. He said, oh, let's stretch our legs. You never know, you might pick up a spear point or something here. And I'm not a big artifact guy. I don't go looking for them, so I just about stepped on this when I got out of the helicopter. And this was actually the one that I sent Art pictures of and received the answer that another rock had done this. So I unwilling to settle for one opinion, I went to this guy, and that's Barry Dana, former Penobscot chief, and his wife Lori, and there's some Abenaki rose corn that they grow. I said, Barry, put this in your hand and tell me what you think of it, because the rock really fits your hand like a glove. So he did, and it was there about 2 seconds, and then he turned that hand over and started sawing with his left hand. And I said, that's what I think too. And I haven't yet seen Art to tell him, but I did see Barry at the Common Ground Fair this year, and he said, I've got to tell you, we use that rock to start every ceremonial fire now. Because when I showed it to him, I said, I think your grandfather dropped it. You better keep it and see if it works. And he did, and he was happy to have it, and he said it is vastly superior for starting a bow drill fire because it doesn't wear out, it doesn't get hot, you don't drop it. It's like part of your hand, and it really lets you grind. And if you ask him, he would say unquestionably that's what it was. He doesn't know any archaeologists, that's his problem. And this is another guy, if you ever get a chance to meet David Moses Bridges, who is Passamaquoddy. And actually, I have to give photo credit. Nick took this picture, and I just cropped it down to show David. But this happens every summer up at Searsport. They're making a birch bark canoe And as we were saying at our dinner table, the guy who kind of spearheaded this, there are two of them. One was named Henri Vaillancourt, a French-Canadian guy in New Hampshire. And if you've ever read the Chappelle book about canoes, the whole quest to meet Henri Vaillancourt is part of that. I think Barry and Steve might have gone over to talk to Henri too, because Barry was telling me a story about looking for some guy, and he only knew the town in New Hampshire, but as they were driving the roads fruitlessly, he saw someone in their backyard using a crooked knife. And he said, let's talk to this guy. And it wound up being this Henri Vaillancourt. But I think Steve Cayard, who is just as white as any of us, and who was the one who really tracked down all of the steps in making these birch bark canoes, and now shares them with a lot of native people. The guy in the gray t-shirt is Abenaki, and his Indian name is Otter, and his name is Eric. I forget his last name. And then David Moses Bridges, his canoes and baskets are truly works of art. One of his canoes is at the Andrew Wyeth house out on the island off Tennant's Harbor. I mean, that's the quality of work that he does. As you might guess, just watching him, put the pitch on the seams. But what I like about, working with guys like Barry and David, and the fact that guys like Steve or myself are welcome to share this stuff with them, which was entirely the reaction my first book got. Not anger about a white guy rewriting their history, but rather gratitude, because I kind of focused on really old things that might have been lost or on the verge of being lost. And both Barry and David have been incredibly warm and open and willing to work with me. And that's kind of the future I'm hoping for, is where we get past this red and white and just settle into kind of a pink state of Maine or state of the nation, and retrieve a lot of this old stuff. So I think I've talked long enough, Ed, given the late start. I'm happy to take questions. As I said, I have about 8 books with me, and I'm the world's worst salesman because I'm never prepared. No, I can't take a credit card.
I think
yes, I will take a promissory note written on the back of a Walmart receipt. But I do have them, and if anyone brought old books that you have and want me to sign them, I even remembered to bring a pen. So thank you very much. Do you want to do it, or do you want me to do any questions?
We could take 5-10 minutes for questions, and then people want to talk to you further, they can talk to you off to the side while we clean up this room, and we're going to stack up the chairs and put them against the walls there and so forth, and we'll have the drawing before
Okay.
you get off center fish.
Go ahead.
Have you come across any petroglyphs?
I guess I know where to go to see them. Barry keeps track of that sort of stuff, and Nick knows where some of them are down east. But I'm not as strong on the field portion. I don't have the wherewithal to go scrambling around. I've actually heard about petroglyphs on the lower St. George River, and this is from the mother of a man who has probably the best artifact collection in the state of Maine that he's picked up along the from Cushing to Warren. A guy named Chris Adams, who works as a pharmacist in Rockland. But people don't really know about his collection yet. It's going to blow people away when it gets published, if it ever does. Yeah.
What is that symbol that looks like an 8 that's part of?
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. The Jesuits who came in the 1600s to basically the St. Lawrence River, Quebec, Montreal. When they were recording the Indian language, there's a phoneme in it that you sometimes hear called the whistled vowel, but they use it both as a vowel and a consonant. It's like W or oo, but there's kind of a whistle that it comes out with, and that 8 was the way the Jesuits represented that sound. Oui, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Ah, oui. No, I know 8. I got it. Yeah. So anyway, that's, it's, and that has confused a lot of people, including my editor and publisher. Yeah.
There's a section of the West Branch of the Cram River that's it's called the Sardahunk.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea what the meaning is?
Yeah, that's an easy one to resolve. Nassau, first of all, Nashua, New Hampshire. There's a Nashwaak up in Nova Scotia. Anytime you see that Nashua, or in this case Nessawa, it means between, something between two other things. Aden means mountain, and hunk means fast-moving stream as a suffix. So you would look for a fast-moving stream between two mountains, in this case double top on the west, and the Katahdin Massif on the east. And yeah, but fast stream between two mountains is Nassau and Nahunk. And the reason some old maps start it with S is because that N was just barely pronounced by the Native Americans. So it's there, that first NE is there, but a lot of European ears couldn't hear it, so some maps call it Sourdnahunk. But that's what it means. Yeah. And that one is lead pipe cinch. Nobody argues with that. That's one of the easier translations. Yeah.
Yes. Have you got any ideas on the origin of the name Androscoggin?
Well, it's corrupted by the fact that there was a white guy named Andros at the time. The original Indian name for it, the Kangan on the end of it, is about, again, it's not like a factory in the European sense, but it's about production, some kind of a manual improvement of something. So it's a thing, but there's an element of technology to it, where things are done to things. And the first two syllables, amus, amus means spawning fish. And some of the old maps you see Amascoggin, but I think over the years Andros, being a politician, didn't mind seeing his name appended to anything, and I think his name crept into the river. I've never seen an old map that has anything like Androscoggin on it, representing the Indian words.
Can I add?
Yeah.
I've been working on this for quite a few years. And what you said makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
Because Governor Andros was a very early and a very important person in Maine's history.
Yeah.
But I also found out that the early history of the Kennebec River involved many people from Scotland. And I found out that the word codgen in Scot means a small place, or
Yeah.
I'm translating that as cottage or something.
Yeah.
So Andros Codgen as a cottage or a place where he lived. So that's my interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it is entirely unlike the Wabanaki to give a river one name for its whole length. They called these falls Pejepscut. And then there's an old thing you can see on the internet now called Perepole deposition, Perepole. And he talks about the different sections of that river that we now call Androscoggin. This lower section was Pejepscut. Up around the falls at Rumford, which is where he said the best Atlantic salmon fishing was, it had a different name. Same thing, this other fork was only the Kennebec, from Merrymeeting Bay up to Augusta area. And Norwich Walk was the river's name up through Norwich Walk. There's one thing I forgot, Ed.
Yep.
I wanted to let people here know, because some of them are in your group, that I routinely, I've done a fair amount of talking around the state, And whenever the subject turns to anadromous fish or conservation in general, I share my heartfelt opinion that the best conservation group in the state is Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. And I often pass this on in emails replying to NRCM emails that I get asking for money, saying things like, once you start doing stuff like FOMB does, I'll consider it. So anyways.